All right, guys. Good evening. Hey, we're gonna try and attempt to get through all of this in one sitting. So I'm gonna do the best I can to try to go fast. But there is a lot of material here, but I want to make sure that we do our best to cover it today and Friday, while still be giving you guys an opportunity to work on your projects Friday in class. All right. So 2 learning targets today. First one, I can describe how the policy of brinkmanship brought us closer to nuclear war, and I can explain how the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the Cold War was to turning hot. And hopefully that'll make a little more sense what we mean with that second one when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But basically it's just talking about us actually having a nuclear war. But before we do that, we got some new blood in the Cold War. So when we talked about the Cold War, we started out by talking about Truman versus Stalin. Well, miraculously, within about a year of each other, both of these guys were gone. Truman decided not to run for office in the 1952 election, and Stalin died in 1953. So in 1953, we see a lot of new blood. We see a new president come into power, a guy by the name of Dwight Eisenhower. And on the side of the Soviets, we see a new person take over the Soviet Union, a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. Hope I have enough room to spell his name. Whoops. Alright, Nikita Khrushchev. Let me erase that and I will. There we go. Okay. So in addition to Eisenhower versus Khrushchev, what we're going to see happen, Eisenhower's elected in 52. In 1960, a new person comes into power, and that person is obviously JFK. So Eisenhower is going to take on Khrushchev, and JFK is also going to take on Khrushchev, and that's who we're going to focus on today. Those 3 guys, 1, 2, and 3. All right, so Ike Eisenhower, that's what people call him. His slogan was, "I like Ike." Ike was a general, and he was successful during World War II. And so he was a military general, so he was a badass. I mean, that's just kind of who he was. And Eisenhower developed a policy known as brinkmanship. And what does it mean to go to the brink? It means basically the hope is that you one-up your enemy with the hope that your enemy backs down. So they bring, 1 gun to the party. The hope is that if you bring 3 guns, they're going to step down and they are going to, that they will eventually back down to you. So it's constantly trying to one-up each other. Why this is bad is because we are constantly trying to outdo the other, because neither the Soviets nor the U.S. want to back down from the other, so we are going to constantly keep building and building and building our nuclear military supplies. And so we have more and more and more supplies, and the thought is that we are going to start using these supplies. So instead of brinkmanship working in favor for the U.S., it really is a negative for both of us, because with brinkmanship, we are building up our military supplies, and that's on both ends. Now, in addition to brinkmanship, Eisenhower establishes a policy known as massive retaliation. And what massive retaliation is that any step or any action against the U.S. would mean all-out nuclear war on our end. So if one missile, whether it's nuclear or not, is sent and hit the United States, we would send every single nuclear missile, rocket, whatever that we have to the Soviet Union. An easy way to kind of think about this is, let's say I'm out and somebody comes up and pushes me in the back. The thought process of massive retaliation is that if I have my fist, I'm going to jack him in the face. If I have a baseball bat with me, I'm going to beat him with my baseball bat. If I have a gun, I'm going to shoot him. Whatever I've got, I'm going to use. And that's what massive retaliation is. And while it sounds like a good idea, again, going back to this idea of brinkmanship, the thought process is that both of us have so many materials that brinkmanship and massive retaliation are going to bring us further and further to actual war because we have to use what we are building up. Now, in addition to this, Dwight signs his own doctrine, something known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine, what it basically says is that any country that asks for help, military help in particular, from us will get it. And he's talking kind of specifically about the Middle East, because the Middle East is very unsettled. Again, we are trying to contain communism in the Middle East. And so while it's geared towards the Middle East, he doesn't specifically mention it. He just says any country that asks for military help will get it. So the Eisenhower Doctrine is strictly military, and it's kind of geared towards the Middle East, but we'll say kind of anyone can get it. The Truman Doctrine was economic, so money and military, and it was geared towards Turkey and Greece. And the Marshall Plan was all economic, so all money. Remember, that was the $12.5 billion, and that was to countries in Europe. Okay, in particular, Western Europe. So these are three documents that we are going to use to try to contain communism. Eisenhower just kind of adds his own flavor. And again, we are expanding outward. So we started out talking about Europe, then we got to the Far East, talking about Korea and China, and now we are focusing on the Middle East, and we will eventually talk about how we react to Latin America as well. Now what we're going to focus on is we are going to focus on JFK. And JFK is a little bit different. Okay? So JFK's foreign policy, similar to the rest. We want to contain communism. And even though JFK is seen to be a little softer, okay, JFK is perceived to be soft, and people don't think he's going to be as tough as Eisenhower and Truman were. He's not. JFK kind of continues the legacy of Eisenhower in some regards. In some ways he doesn't, but for the most part, JFK is tough on communism. And he, in particular, has a fierce, fierce rivalry with Khrushchev. JFK's biggest challenge, though, is Cuba. Okay, JFK's biggest challenge is Cuba, and the rivalry that he also develops with Fidel Castro. So, the first thing that we are going to look at is something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was JFK's kind of first miscue as far as the Cold War goes. So, the Bay of Pigs invasion involved the U.S., and it involved Cuba. And in particular with the U.S., it involved JFK. And the Bay of Pigs invasion was developed during Eisenhower's presidency, but it was carried out by JFK. So JFK sends Secret Service and military to Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. And why does he do this? Why does he want to overthrow Castro? He wants to overthrow Castro because Castro is on the same page as Khrushchev. Okay, they are boys. And he knows that something is up. He knows that they are allies. So if he can take Castro out, then he can essentially get rid of Khrushchev in the West. The end result is that it does not work. The Bay of Pigs is a failure. And JFK is kind of laughed at throughout the world. And not to mention, the rest of the world, or I'm sorry, Cuba and the Soviets are not happy with this at all. Now, the last thing we're going to look at is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, since Khrushchev and Castro are like BFFs, Khrushchev convinces Castro to put missiles in Cuba, nuclear missiles. Whoops, forgot missiles. Kind of an important word there. Alright, so why does he do that? Why does Khrushchev convince him to put missiles in? Well, you guys can see right here, location, location, location. The distance from Cuba to the U.S. is so close that it is a launching pad. Khrushchev views Cuba as a launching pad and wants to take advantage of the closeness of the proximity. So JFK's response, what does JFK do? He puts a blockade up all around Cuba. And he makes it so that Soviet boats that are carrying these nuclear missiles cannot get to Cuba. And so the thought process is that you will have the U.S. Navy and the Russian military, the Soviet military, go head-to-head, and we will start to have nuclear war in the Atlantic Ocean. And as you guys can see right here, this was the quote. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the height, I'll say it again, the height of the Cold War. This was the closest we have ever gotten to nuclear war. I'm going to go back to this quote. We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. The blockade of the Soviets works fantastically. The Soviets, they end up retreating back. They do not send any more missiles to Cuba. In fact, they remove all of their missiles that they had in Cuba and they bring them back to the Soviet Union. This is a huge black eye for Khrushchev and a huge win for JFK. But again, the Cuban Missile Crisis for the third time was the height of the Cold War and the closest that we have ever come to nuclear war. Alright, so, quick review. Can you describe how brinkmanship brought us closer to war, and can you explain how the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we've ever been to nuclear war? If you can do that, then you are good to go. I apologize for the length on this, guys, but that's the last PowerPoint that we'll have for probably I'd say about 2 weeks. Alright, so have a great night, and I will see you guys on Thursday.